Good evening, everyone. We're continuing our Sharia Crime Stoppers webinars, and we've been very, very fortunate. We appreciate your response. We are part of the United West. Your response to the last several weeks has been very, very encouraging, and we're picking up momentum that we need as we move forward to try to deal with what we're involved in. Every Tuesday night we'll be here tonight. In addition to Mary, our co-host, welcome, Mary.
Hello, everybody, tonight.
In addition, Alex Newman is with us, so we're continuing our really wonderful opportunity to bring people with real domain expertise to you, to present information to you, to explain things you may not have thought about, and tonight's a great example. Alex is going to talk about saving our freedom by rescuing our children, and that title is quite compelling. Alex Newman, welcome.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be with you guys, and thank you to everybody out there watching. I really appreciate you spending some time with us, and I hope the presentation will be informative.
Okay, so we're going to invite you to, particularly the new people, look at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a Q&A button. You're extremely welcome as we go through the presentation. We're going to have a presentation by Alex, and then we'll come back and bring your questions forward. So look at the Q&A button on the bottom. You type in your questions, and then Mary will administer your questions when we get to that point. So again, a really important topic. Alex, we're going to invite you to share your screen and get us going on your presentation.
Very good.
While Alex is doing that, I'll mention to you, those of you that don't know Alex that well, he's a freelance writer and journalist, and he's written for many prominent journals, including the New American. So we're ready to go.
Excellent. So everybody can see my screen. Let me just make sure I am sharing my sound too. Here we go. Share computer sound, and we should be ready to go. So again, thank you all for being with me. I am Alex Newman, as you mentioned. Education has really been my passion for a number of years now. Started off in 2013, 2014. I worked on this book here, Crimes of the Educators, How Utopians Are Using Government Schools to Destroy America's Children. And that was in partnership with Dr. Samuel Blumenfeld, who actually spent about 60 years of his long life looking into what was happening in the educational system. Wrote 13 books on education. Crimes of the Educators was the last one he ever published, and I was immensely privileged and honored to be able to work on that with him. Just in my opinion, a phenomenal project, and that kind of got me thinking, and it finally made a light bulb go off in my mind, and I realized, whoa, all these other battles that we're fighting are going to depend on the outcome of the education battle. If we lose on the education battle, we're going to lose every one of the other battles. We'll have open borders, we'll have endless taxpayer-funded abortions, we'll have the destruction of our churches, our communities, our families, our system of government, our free political institutions, our liberties, all of it. You can kiss it goodbye. And so what I have been doing all year this year, in the beginning of 2019, we put together this special report here in the New American Magazine called Rescuing Our Children. We also have a DVD, which will be somewhat similar to what we're going to go over today. And my goal, I went on a national speaking tour this summer. I gave over 55 talks in 30-something states, and I'm still going. I'll be going up to New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Connecticut very soon, and been given versions of this talk, not just across the United States, but also around the world. And my goal is to rescue as many children as possible from the indoctrination, from the deliberate dumbing down that I'm going to be going through with you guys tonight. So with that out of the way, some background. Here's some polling data. I think this is really alarming. You now have over 50% of American young people aren't even sure God exists anymore. This, of course, is a direct result of the indoctrination in the public schools. 73% want the government to control their health care. Half of the young people would rather live in a socialist country, and almost half want to abolish our border agency. And speaking of socialists, this guy here, Adolf Hitler, was, of course, one of the world's best-known socialists. He was the leader of the National Socialist Party of Germany, but they don't teach the children that at school anymore when they're teaching them to be a little socialist. He was wrong on just about everything, but he was right about one important thing. He said that he alone who owns the youth gains the future. And if you think about it, it's almost self-evident, right? So Hitler put a lot of money into his war machine, into the military, into strategic planning and all the rest of it. But really the central pillar of his strategy was brainwashing the youth of Germany. And he said it openly, right? He was the first world leader to actually criminalize homeschooling. Up until that point, there had never been a government that we're aware of in all human history that had made it a criminal offense to educate your own children. In fact, this was almost inconceivable to people, at that time, almost 100 years ago now. The idea that the government would criminalize you educating your own children. But there's a reason why he did it, right? He knew that as long as parents were educating and raising their children, it would be much more difficult to build this crazy 1,000-year Reich that he was seeking. And so he went for the children, just like dictators all throughout the 20th century did. Stalin, Lenin, Mao, and the list goes on. Now, we're seeing the exact same phenomenon occurring in the United States today, where they're trying to get parents out and the government in. And you don't have to take my word for it. One of the reasons I do with this PowerPoint presentation is so you guys can watch these videos and you'll see the evidence for yourself. So this is Melissa Harris Perry speaking on MSLSD about the need to get parents out of the way.
We have never invested as much in public education as we should have because we've always had kind of a private notion of children. Your kid is yours and totally your responsibility. We haven't had a very collective notion of these are our children. So part of it is we have to break through our kind of private idea that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to their families and recognize that kids belong to whole communities. Once it's everybody's responsibility and not just the households, then we start making better investments.
Yeah, collective child rearing, right? Because we all know how well collective farming worked in the Soviet Union, so why wouldn't we want to do that with our children, right? I mean, that's crazy talk, right? But that's on national television in the United States of America. This is unfortunately official policy in the U.S. government. Before Obama left office, his Secretary of Education and his Secretary of Health and Human Services got together and put together this policy document right here. And they literally say that parents get to be equal partners with the federal government in the raising of their own children. They're talking about you, right? And they talk about mandatory home visits to check that the other equal partners, the parents, are doing what they're supposed to be doing. It is mind-blowing. And again, this is official policy. Hillary Clinton told us more than 2 decades ago that the village needs to raise our children, right? If you read the book, she's talking about the government village raising your children. And then, ta-da, this is the product, right? This is the fruit when the government village raises your children. I'm sure you guys recognize these two. One is David Hogg. The other was his sidekick, Emma Riley, the one who liked to wear communist Cuban patches and militia jackets. And this boy here, David Hogg, after a shooting in Florida, said, our parents don't know how to use an effing democracy. We just need to take control and then we'll fix these problems, right? How are they going to do that? By disarming the American population and bringing socialism to America. Where did they learn this stuff, right? Well, they sat 12 years in a government school being indoctrinated, just like their fellow student who shot up the school. And in fact, if you look at these shootings that we're having, what you'll find over and over and over again is that the shooters actually repeat the same garbage they were taught at school. We didn't used to have these kinds of school shootings in the 40s, in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s. You could order a machine gun through a mail order catalog 100 years ago, and yet the kids did not shoot themselves, shoot each other at school. What changed? It's what they're teaching the children, obviously. Now, before we get into what they are teaching the children, I do want to point out that there is a kind of an end destination in mind. They do have a goal which they are working toward, which they are preparing your children for. And rather than tell you about it myself, I think it's more compelling if you just hear it from them. So we're going to watch just a couple of short videos of high-ranking people telling you what the agenda is, and then we'll see how the public education system is central.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
So that's a lot to unpack in there, but notice the confidence that he's got. When we are successful, and we will be, right? Why is he so confident that they're going to get their new world order with a global rule of law, with the UN's peacekeepers bringing in the vision of the UN's founders? I think the reason's obvious. They have 87% of our children all day, every day, 5 days a week, 8 hours a day for 12 years minimum. Of course they're confident. They have every reason to be confident, right? What do you think you're going to be able to do to compete with that in 30 minutes at dinner and an hour at Sunday school, right? Nothing is the answer. And if you think about what he said, it's really explosive. He talked about this global rule of law that would govern the conduct of nations, that we would have a credible United Nations using its peacekeeping role, by which he means, of course, its military forces, you know, the guys with the blue helmets, infamous for raping women and children all over the world without any kind of sanctions whatsoever. To bring about the vision of the UN's founders. And that is very revealing, too. We know quite a bit about the UN's founders. On one side of the discussions, you had Joseph Stalin, one of the worst mass murderers to ever walk on this planet. Then on the other side of the table, you had the American representative, right, Alger Hiss. And boy, did they love him, right? They liked him so much, they made him the first Secretary General of the UN. He got to run the conference where they came up with the UN Charter. And then we threw him in prison because we found out he was working for Joseph Stalin. He was literally a Soviet agent. So why we would want to give up the vision of our founding fathers, the idea that God created us all equally, that God endowed us with certain rights, that political institutions, that governments are instituted among men to protect these rights, why we would want to give that up, something that countless thousands of Americans have given their lives for this crazy vision of the UN's founders, is something I think we ought to have a discussion about, right? It's not just something that you go on national television and say, when we are successful, and we will be, then you know, this is going to happen. They didn't ask us, right? And of course, it's not just a Republican problem. Here's the leader of the Communist Party for the 2020 election saying the same thing.
The affirmative task we have now is to actually create a new world order.
Yep, new world order. And here's
after 1989, President Bush said, and it's a phrase that I often use myself, that we needed a new world order.
So anyway, we could sit here for a week watching world leaders talk about this need for a new world order and how the UN is going to run it all, and we're going to get into some more of the mechanics. But if you want to know who these people are, what they're really up to, I recommend you get a copy of this special report we did in the New American Magazine. This is what I worked on in 2018. This was our first issue of the year. It was January 1st, 2018. And we basically pull the covers back on the operatives within this deep state, and, you know, what they're doing against Trump, what they're doing to destroy America, to open the borders, to, you know, bring massive numbers of Islamists across the borders into the Western world, and on and on. The simplest way to understand their objectives, you know, they describe it as sustainable development and global governance and you know, progressivism, all those kind of things. If you really want to understand what they're talking about, the simplest way to wrap your head around it, and this applies in almost every case, right, when you look at their agenda, is just take everything that God instructed in the Bible and flip it upside down. So, you know, God created male and female, so what do they tell us now? Oh, well, actually, you can be any gender you want, and there's infinite genders, and if you disagree, you're a bigot. Now, in the UK, in the schools, they're teaching the children that you'll go to jail if you disagree with this crazy idea that there's infinite genders. What do they teach about marriage, right? Well, you know, marriage used to be between a man and a woman, but now we're more enlightened. Now marriage can be between, you know, 2 men, 1 woman, and 3 dogs, or 2 goats, right? We see an attack on private property, right? God said, thou shalt not steal. And so what do they teach the kids? Oh, private property is bad. We need to redistribute it. We need to have socialism, and so on, right? In every case, as you'll see, you can just take what God said in the Bible, flip it upside down, and you really understand where they're going with this. Obviously, this translates into a war on our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence and our God-given rights, because, of course, these were all inspired by the biblical worldview of the founders. And they have concrete policy tools and international agreements that are guiding this whole process. The reason I bring them up is because they are so clear that the central element of the strategy to bring this all about is the so-called education of your children, or more accurately, the indoctrination of your children. So Agenda 21, you know, if you watch CNN fake news, they'll tell you that's a conspiracy theory. We'll address that in a moment. They've also got Agenda 2030, which they call the Sustainable Development Goals. These are kind of like the roadmap. The head of the UN General Assembly, when they adopted Agenda 2030, said it was the master plan for humanity. And so, you know, just so we're clear, Agenda 21 is not a conspiracy theory. CNN is full of it. Here's a couple quick videos. Here's George H.W.
We've signed a climate convention on the importance of economic instruments and free markets. We're included in this mammoth Agenda 21 document.
There you go. And here is the leader of the Communist Party in Congress.
The Earth Summit Environmental Leadership Act, as this is known, presents us with an opportunity to follow up on the important work of the Earth Summit to develop its blueprint, Agenda 21, for global environmental action. HCON Res 353 outlines a comprehensive national strategy for sustainable development in accordance with the principles of Agenda 21.
So a comprehensive national strategy to implement Agenda 21. Boy, that sounds fun, right? Well, what is Agenda 21? According to the people who wrote it, they tell us that it's intended to be implemented by every person on Earth, and that it's going to require a profound reorientation of all human society unlike anything the world has ever experienced. You think they got big plans? Yeah, they do, right? And then when you get to chapter 36, you can read Agenda 21 on the internet, on the UN's webpage. They tell you how they're going to get there, right? They call us bitter clingers. You know, they know that older generations of Americans were brought up to love freedom, to love America, to love our founding fathers. They know most of us are Christian. They know we're not going to readily surrender our farms and our property and our children and our families and our churches and our liberties and our Constitution. So that's why they call us bitter clingers, right? We bitterly cling to our guns and our Bibles and our Constitution and our freedoms. And so they know they're not going to get us, right? You can't teach an old dog new tricks. And so they're going for the kids, and they will tell you that they're going for the kids. In chapter 36, they say education is critical for promoting this totalitarian ideology of theirs known as sustainable development. They say education is going to be indispensable to changing people's attitudes, and there's going to have to be a lot of attitude changing. They say it's going to be critical for changing their skills, their behavior, their values. It's got to be in all disciplines, right? Not just in science class. It's got to be in history and science and English and math and you name it. And it must include spiritual development. Now, to give you a kind of a sample of what they're teaching the kids on this, and they are teaching the kids on this in every government school on this planet. This is a book here called Rescue Mission Planet Earth, a children's edition of Agenda 21. I actually have a copy behind me. You probably can't see it because it's way up there high on my bookshelf, but I have a copy of this, and it's in government schools all over the world. And just to give you a sample of the stuff they're teaching the children, you can look at this page here. You see the Hindu gods are very upset because the storks are delivering all these babies. And on the next page, it tells you that the earth groans every time it registers another birth, right? So what are they teaching our children? Don't have children, right? And what does God say about children? God said children are a blessing. He said children are a reward from the Lord. He said we should be fruitful and multiply, right? And so what do they teach American children? Oh man, Mother Earth is groaning every time you have a baby, right? That is exactly why the American population is declining, except for the massive numbers of immigrants who are coming in and who are actually being encouraged to have many, many children, especially Muslims, and they can all live on welfare, right? This is very deliberate. This is very strategic, right? Replace the population. We've seen it in Northern Europe. We've seen it in Western Europe. We're going to start seeing it very soon in the United States, right? London, British people, are now a minority in their own capital city. And you have a Muslim mayor, Sadiq Khan. How did they do this? Well, they convinced British people to stop having children. They convinced British people to open up their borders wide. And what happened? They lost control of their country. Right? I was down at the UN Conference on Sustainable Development in Rio de Janeiro in 2012. I go to a lot of these UN summits. I'll be in Chile in a few months. I was in Poland a few months ago for these UN summits. I go to a lot of these as a journalist, mostly for the New American Magazine. And one fun fact is that it was chaired by a Chinese communist, the whole summit was. And you see this image here. They had a lot of these. They had conscripted children into drawing these posters that they had placed all over the venue. And you see the Earth there. He looks very sick, or she, Mother Earth, right, looks very sick. And the doctor diagnoses the problem and say, you have humans, right? So humans are the disease, but the UN is going to be the cure for the disease. So now they've got Agenda 2030. Obama helped lead the way on this. The Communist Chinese bragged that they played a crucial role in developing this. And it's 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And again, they'll tell you your children are the central element of their strategy in making this totalitarian dream possible. So they'll tell you right in the agreement, every government on the planet agreed to this. Children are critical agents of change. They're going to find in these new goals a platform to channel their infinite capacities for activism into the creation of a better world. Well, isn't that nice? Don't we all want a better world? Well, yes. But what does the UN mean? We'll go down to goal number 10, and they'll tell you, we got to reduce inequality within and among countries. That's only going to be possible if we share the wealth and if we address income inequality, right? Direct from the thing. So not only can we not have national socialism, now it's not enough with national socialism. Now we need global socialism to implement this UN vision. And they're telling us this, right? This is the exact same kind of rhetoric we've heard from every mass murdering communist dictator of the last 100 years. And then you get down to goal number 4, and they'll tell you, in plain English, by 2030, all of your children need to be so brainwashed, they're not just going to passively submit to this crazy ideology of sustainable development, they will actually promote it, is the word that the United Nations uses. The head of the UN, when this was adopted, called it the Declaration of Interdependence. I told you the head of the General Assembly called it the Master Plan for Humanity. And here's a video from UNESCO, the UN Education Agency, talking about how they're going to bring this about.
We achieve sustainable development that protects our planet and builds a more inclusive, equal, and peaceful world without education. We can't Sustainable development begins with education. Put global education first.
So that's the UN telling you, right? You don't have to believe me. That's a UN video. I pulled it right off the UN's website. They said sustainable development begins with brainwashing your children, or sorry, education, as they like to refer to it, right? Again, this is right off UNESCO's website. Now, they've become very experienced at doing this, right? They have a long history of doing this. They've been perfecting their strategies and techniques and their psychological conditioning for over 100 years. You know, going all the way back to the Soviet Union, where a lot of these experiments were conducted, and they are now masters at completely undermining everything you try to teach your children. So I'm going to give you an example. Actually, I'll give you a few examples of what's happening. A generation ago, if you had told people that we were going to be celebrating so-called homosexual marriages in America, you would have been laughed at and ridiculed as a kook and an extremist. How do I know? Because that's what people who warned about this were called, right? Oh, you're totally crazy. You know, take the guy to the funny farm. He's nuts. Well, I want to show you what they were showing your children in the early 90s, back when nobody was talking about this, right? Sodomy was still a crime across most of the United States when they started showing this video to school children in government schools all over America. It's called It's Elementary, talking about gay issues in school. Now, here is one relevant clip from this video that they showed your children.
Let me tell you quickly the background. Today, the law says that if you're the same sex, 2 men and 2 women, you can't get married. It is against the law. And I thought that it might be kind of fun for us to sort of be pretend judges for a few minutes. What I'm going to give each of you is a sheet that just tells you that some people think that it's wrong for gays to get married, that it's not natural, and that it goes against what a family is. Other people think that the state should not decide these things, that it should just be up to 2 adults to decide what they want to do. What do you think the answer to these questions are? Should gays be allowed to marry? Should they not?
Anyway, they go on now and they show all the kids agreeing. And did you guys catch what they said? Let's be pretend judges here. You know, oh, how unfair that homosexuals aren't allowed to be married. And what happened? Within a generation, the Supreme Court struck down marriage laws all across America. And, you know, keep in mind, they couldn't even get this passed on the ballot in California, the land of fruits and nuts, right? But they knew they had prepared an entire generation of young people to accept the idea that the pretend judges on the Supreme Court would be able to overturn our marriage laws, and that's exactly what they did. Now today we see drag.
And if you haven't heard the name Desmond Napolis, get ready for this trailblazing 11-year-old drag kid who RuPaul is calling the future. His bravery is inspiring so many. We're going to talk to him in just a moment, but first, let's take a look at his amazing story.
So anyways, you get the idea. It's crazy, right? Well, I'm going to show you what they're teaching the kids today now. They're brainwashing them on climate. I'm sure if you've watched the news lately, you've seen all the brainwashed children running around New York and Australia and Sweden crying about global warming and demanding that the UN save us. Well, if you went to school prior to like 2005, you probably learned that carbon dioxide is like the gas of life, right? The average human exhales about 2.5 pounds of it per day. Plants use it for photosynthesis, and then the plants release oxygen back into the atmosphere. It's a nice, beautiful cycle of life that God has created. Well, what they're teaching the children, and this is going to sound totally crazy to people who had, you know, any reasonable education prior to 2005, is that carbon dioxide is not only not the gas of life, it is a dangerous, toxic pollution that's going to kill us all unless we let the United Nations tax and regulate it and take control of our lives and our economies. And I realize that from a scientific perspective, that is absolutely ludicrous, right? I've been following the UN climate circus around the world for over a decade now, and it is crazy town. But from a totalitarian perspective, it is simply genius, right? If CO2 is pollution and every single thing humans do emits CO2, I mean, you can't even die without emitting CO2, right? You die, you decompose, CO2 comes out. There's nothing that would be outside the purview of their taxing and regulatory authority. So take a look at what the UN says about this.
We hope that as many schools as possible will follow examples like this, and we will support them in their efforts.
And it's them telling you, not me.
Education is a powerful tool to address climate change and to ensure that the rights and needs of people today and tomorrow can be met. Let us use it and get active today.
How in the world is education going to do anything about climate change, right? I mean, you know, the Vikings, they used to farm on Greenland back when the world was much warmer, and it started getting colder and colder and colder, and they said, you know what, we ought to sacrifice some children to try to stop the climate change. Does anybody think that the climate stopped changing by sacrificing children? Of course not, right? Of course not. That's obvious. That's ridiculous. I submit to you that that was probably just as effective as educating children to stop the climate from changing, right? It's ludicrous, and anybody with any scientific common sense could tell you that. In fact, I've interviewed a lot of the UN's own scientists. They'll tell you the whole thing is a giant, enormous hoax. But there's the UN telling you the way they're going to do it, they're going to brainwash the kids. This is what it looks like in American schools.
You've heard the reports. The globe's warming. It's our fault, and the consequences will be terrible. Children are frightened.
I worry. My mom worries. The water might rise and it might flood the whole town. We won't be able to survive for long.
What are you most worried will happen?
We'll all die.
Are there some people who say this isn't true?
Yes. Yes.
Might they be right?
No.
How do you know they're not right?
Well, because the earth is getting hotter.
Where do you learn this?
Can't you see?
And now watch out for political activists. I give this letter for that.
One of the main components after educating the students of global warming is that they're given a letter for their families to sign, and this is the congressman or woman. It's for Congress to pass comprehensive climate and energy.
Anyways, you get the point, right? And then this is what you see on the other end, a bunch of brainwashed kids demanding climate action. So, a lot of us still have this naive idea that we're sending our kids to school to learn how to read, write, and do math. Well, the senior policy advisor on education under Ronald Reagan, Dr. Charlotte Iserbyt, she's actually become a very good friend of mine in recent years. She figured out when she got to the Department of Education, they were turning American schools into replicas of the Soviet schools. She put all the documents in this book here. And this is what she says is really going on.
You think the purpose of education is reading, writing, and arithmetic? The purpose of education is to change the thoughts, actions, and feelings of students.
And here it is from Shirley McCoon. She was writing national standards for the United States before most of us even realized we had national standards. This was back during the Clinton administration. Here's what she says. She was speaking to the National Governors Association.
Fix up these schools and taking care of them, rather than the issue of understanding that what we're into is a total restructuring of the society.
In the interest of time, we'll skip through this, but check out what she says now about the role of schools in this fundamental, total transformation of our society.
The other function of schools, which sounds paradoxical and yet in a sense is really not, is the fact that we have to prepare students not for today's society, but for a society that's 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road. And so we have to anticipate what the future is, and then move back and figure out what it is we need to do today. That's called anticipatory socialization, or the social change function of schools.
Social change function of schools. How many of you guys knew that the schools had a social change function, right? You thought it was to teach your kids to read. Wrong, right? So part of this fundamental transformation of our society is the complete breakdown of common sense, morality, reality, objective truth, and on and on. So at the Chasko Middle School, a girl decided she was actually a boy, so the administration said, hey, you should go shower and change with the boys before and after PE class. Then they ordered the male PE teacher to go in there and supervise a minor, underage girl naked in the boys' locker room. Obviously, he refused, so they threatened his job. They threatened his teaching credential. They said, we're going to fire you, and we're going to revoke your teaching credential, so you will never teach again. In Minnesota, they went even further. They decided, you know what? The parents are the junior partners here. We'll be the senior partners. And this little boy decided he actually felt like a girl. So mom, dad, can I have a sex change? Yeah, absolutely, positively not. So he went to the school. The school took him to go have his genitals surgically removed. Now there's a federal lawsuit going on about it. It might go all the way to the Supreme Court, but the boy's genitals are gone, right? You can't reattach them. That ship has sailed. In California, they just recently adopted a new health education framework. They want to teach 5-year-olds that there are infinite genders. They tell them you could be agender, bigender, trigender, new trois, free spirit, all kinds of things I can't even pronounce. And that if you disagree, you are a bigot. Then when they get to middle school, they teach them about polyamorous relationships. So you can have 3 women, 5 guys, 2 goats, and maybe a puppy dog. And that'll be your family, right? In a sexual relationship. And by the time they get to high school, they teach the kids things that are so horrifying you can't even say them. Now, I want to show you guys this here, because California passed a law saying that you had to teach the kids the history of the LGBT movement. And that was pretty crazy in and of itself. They started teaching them that Harvey Milk, the first homosexual elected official, was a superhero. They didn't teach him that he was a child rapist, and some of the children he had raped went on to go commit suicide. But they did start teaching. I actually got a copy of the curriculum that, as part of the history of the LGBT, ancient Greek men used to take young boys under their wing and they would have lots of sex with them. And, totally normal, right? Just normalizing this stuff. So a mom went to the meeting and said, "Why are you teaching my children pedophilia?" And this is what the assistant superintendent explained.
Answer me why you're teaching pedophilia in school, to ninth graders. Teaching what? Pedophilia. Pederasty, right here. Pederasty, as I discussed with you before, twice in my office when you come to view the materials, I've explained to you that this is done because we are talking about historical perspectives of how gender relations and different types of sexual orientations have existed in history. So this is something, a man and a boy is a sexual orientation. Something that's occurred in history, and so this is really important for us to include.
So it's a sexual orientation, right? Did you guys all catch that? In California, it's against the law to discriminate based on sexual orientation. So how long until these brainwashed children say, well, of course you need to hire a pedophile to run your Sunday school ministry. You don't want to discriminate based on sexual orientation, do you? That's where this is going, folks. They are breaking down the final taboos, the final moral boundaries that keep our civilization together. She also said it's something that occurred in history. Well, of course we have to teach the children. Well, you know what? I can think of a lot of things that occurred in history that they're not teaching the children that would be far more useful to their lives. How about the Islamic invasions of Europe? How about the fact that Jesus walked on this planet and totally changed everything, right? They're not teaching the kids any of that. Why not? Well, I don't know. Somebody should ask them. It is against the law to opt your children out of this mandatory LGBT brainwashing, and they're doing it in college, too. This is a college in San Diego teaching the same thing. I don't know if you can see on the board there, but it says pedophilia as a sexual orientation. Here's the Drag Queen Story Hour. These are in schools all over America. They brag on their website. They're in first, second grade classrooms, kindergarten. Obviously, that's a man wearing a dress and some demon horns, just so you would know it came straight from the pit of hell. Right? Here is Jessica Lahore, a drag queen that they brought in for Career Day to Rocky Top Middle School in Colorado. She rounded up a mob of LGBT activists to come after me. They said I should kill myself in the name of love and tolerance, right? That's how tolerant they are. If you disagree that this should be presented to children, you should die. That's what they think, right? And it's working. They're doing a phenomenal job in accomplishing their objectives. According to the UCLA, they did a survey. They said 27% of California's children are now gender non-conforming. Think about that, folks. I was a kid not that long ago. I grew up in 8 countries on 4 continents. So I went to school with kids of all different religions and backgrounds and shapes and sizes and nationalities. I never once in all my years met a boy who thought he was a girl. I never once met a girl who thought she was a boy. In fact, the word transgender wasn't even in the dictionary when I was a kid, right? Now, 27% of California's children have succumbed to this absolute madness. According to this survey by NBC Fake News, national survey, 20% of millennials now identify as LGBTQ whatever. That's one reason I no longer identify as a millennial, right? It's embarrassing. You tell people you're a millennial, they're like, oh, so you're an idiot, right? Okay, yeah, good. And no, we're not all idiots, right? Some of us are, unfortunately, but not all. Now, UNESCO, the UN Education Agency, they have a new global sexual education guidelines. It's like global common core for sex ed. They want it all over the world. They say 5-year-olds need to know about masturbation and sexual pleasure. It sounds to me like some pedophiles grooming children wrote this document hoping to get their hands on little children. By the time the kids are 9, they're supposed to be able to defend why taxpayers should pay for abortions. And they say, oh, but it's evidence-backed, right? And you go to their evidence and it's all Planned Parenthood, right? Surprise. Here they are singing praises to our dear leader.
Okay, now everybody, let's sing it together on the count of 3. All right. Yeah. I like that. 1, 2, 3.
Barack Hussein Obama. He said we all must lend a hand to make this country strong again.
Can you imagine if those kids were singing about Trump, right? There would be heads exploding all over the fake news networks and CNN and all the rest of it. So instead of making America strong again, Obama did bring us Common Core, made us dumber than ever before. They put together a board, a Common Core Validation Committee, and they put 2 subject matter experts on it. I know both of them. They're nice people. The first one here is Sandra Stotsky. She refused to sign off on Common Core, even though she was handpicked by the Common Core people. She said these standards will reduce the ability of children to develop critical thinking skills. They were written hastily by people who didn't care how crummy they were. This lady was not on the board, but she was hired to write reading standards. I interviewed her a few months ago. She said they took out all the great stuff in there to teach kids to read. They replaced it with a bunch of stuff that we know doesn't help kids read at all. In fact, will leave them reading disabled. And now I'm speaking out. Here's the only math expert they put on the Common Core Validation Committee. Said the Common Core was written to reflect very low expectations. They're as non-challenging as possible, extremely serious failings. There are actual errors in the math. They are neither mathematically correct nor especially clear. And so that's from the
What does Common Core mean for your kids? Well, here's a sample math problem.
Compose and decompose numbers from 11 to 19 into 10 ones and some further ones by using objects or drawings and record each.
Anyways, you get the picture, right? It's absolutely crazy. The federal government commissioned a study this year, and after looking at this, they said, oh my goodness, Common Core had significant negative effects after they were adopted, right? In both English and in math. They said the magnitude of the negative effects increases over time. So, hey, we should mandate it in all 50 states, right? The same people who brought you Common Core also brought you national science standards called Next Generation Pseudoscience Standards. You might be surprised to learn that in 12 years, these kids will never once learn about the scientific method. That's a true story. What they will learn is that the gas they exhale is a toxic pollution and only the UN can save us, and that they came from slime that turned into monkeys, that turned into people, and there is no God over billions of years. As long as you know those things, you're good. If you reject those things, you're in trouble. They have fake history, right? Dr. Pesta, who I'm working with on this program, he has been surveying his students at the university, first at Purdue, now at the University of Wisconsin. He's found that every single year he's given the survey, a majority of his students think America invented slavery. If they knew any better, they'd know that slavery has been ubiquitous since the dawn of humanity, and that basically America and Britain, the Anglo-Saxon civilization, was the first one ever to completely eradicate it. In fact, we weren't satisfied just eradicating it in our own countries. We went around the world and eradicated it everywhere. And it took a long time. You know, you could still buy and sell slaves legally in parts of Africa as recently as a decade ago. In Mauritania, they didn't outlaw slavery, buying and selling of slaves until 10 years ago. But hey, right, our American kids have no idea. They just think America is this uniquely evil place. They got Common Core history textbooks that teach them that the Second Amendment is so the government can have a militia, teaches them that Donald Trump is a racist and an extremist and all his supporters are old white racists. Here you have kids bowing down, Islam, right? They take them on field trips. They get the girls to wear headscarves. They bow down. They recite the Shahada, or they, under the guise of practicing calligraphy, they'll write out that Allah is the only God and Muhammad is his messenger and blah, blah, blah. Right? Here's the 5 pillars of Islam posted up at a school in Wichita, Kansas. Right? Can you imagine if the 10 Commandments were there? Can you imagine if instead of reciting all this Islamic nonsense, they were repeating the Lord's Prayer? Can you imagine how the ACLU would absolutely freak out, right? This just came out recently. The Thomas More Law Center found out that teachers in Michigan, and later they found out also Florida, Texas, a whole bunch of other states, were being subjected to indoctrination sessions by this lady here, being paid $2,500 per day to brainwash government school teachers into believing that Islam is awesome, Christianity is horrible, America is a genocidal, evil place, but fortunately the Muslims are here to save us, right? Unbelievable stuff, and yet this is what's happening. Now, the other side of this dumbing down is the data gathering, right? The dumbing down and the indoctrination is only part of the equation. The other side is gathering all the data on your children, more than you could possibly even begin to imagine. So they've got facial expression cameras that monitor the facial expressions that children make and determine whether they need an intervention. So, you know, maybe a drag queen walks in wearing some demon horns. The kid goes, "Ugh, what is that?" Say, aha. This one needs an intervention, right? This is also straight from a Department of Education report. They say that this data that they're capturing from students is going to be used to create models that will predict the future behavior and interests of the children. They try to undermine their moral values. In fact, the UNESCO has a handbook on values clarification. They say the purpose is to undermine children's belief in moral absolutes. And, you know, to give you an example of how this works, they'll tell the kids that maybe there's 9 of you in a life raft. The life raft can only hold 8. But so you got to get rid of someone. You got to throw someone overboard. Who are you going to kill? And you know, the answer is, well, you know, whichever one is least valuable is what the kids are supposed to come up with. But of course, if they had been thinking, they would have said, well, why don't we just take turns swimming alongside the raft, and then we don't have to kill anybody, right? I mean, that'd be the obvious answer. But instead, they're supposed to say, well, hey, wait a minute. My mom and my dad said we shouldn't kill people. The pastor said that. The Bible said that. They must all be wrong. I guess morality is subjective, and it depends on the situation you're in. Maybe there is a time and a place to kill old people and to kill babies. Right? Obviously, the kids are not getting anything remotely resembling a real education. You don't have to take my word for it. The federal government will proudly tell you. You can see the numbers here. Only 1/4 of high school seniors are proficient in math. Only 1/3 of high school seniors are proficient in reading. And of course, they grow up to become illiterate adults. A federal study back in '93 found that half of Americans were either illiterate or functionally illiterate. 2003, same thing. Half of Americans could not even read. In Washington, D.C., 2/3 of the adult population is functionally illiterate. So they went to communist Cuba to figure out what to do about it. It's a true story. Back in the 80s, back when, by comparison, we had a phenomenal, it was still terrible, but by comparison with today, a phenomenal education system. This commission that Reagan put together said that our very future as a nation and as a people is under threat as a result of this educational fiasco. They said if a foreign power had done it to us, we might have viewed it as an act of war, and we should. The reality is we were not always this dumb. In fact, we were once the best educated, most literate society to have ever existed on planet Earth. John Adams wrote in a letter to a friend that a native of America who can't read or write is as rare as a comet or an earthquake. Thomas Jefferson would brag that American farmers were the only ones who read Homer. Go find yourself a high school student today who knows anything about Homer, right? Not Homer Simpson, obviously. Go read the Federalist Papers, right? I mean, this is amazing evidence of the educational level of early Americans. These were written for normal people, right? For merchants and farmers and blacksmiths and shopkeepers, right? These were not for PhDs in, ancient political science and history. These were written for average Joes. And we have a lot of data on early literacy. By 1795, 90% of Americans could read. By around 1800, there are studies showing that almost 100% of people, especially in New England, were literate. This study here in 1812 found that not more than 4 in 1,000 young Americans are unable to write legibly, even neatly. And guess what? None of these kids learned how to read from a government school. In fact, they learned from their parents on the farm or from their grandparents or their older siblings using very, very simple tools like this. It is not that hard to teach reading. I've done it myself. I've taught my own children to read. It takes about 2 months if your kid is a little bit slow. And, they should be reading the King James Bible after 2 to 3 months of very, very basic instruction, right? It's really not that complicated. So what went wrong? Well, this guy here, Horace Mann, he had been inspired by the King of Prussia, who himself had been inspired by a pre-Marx communist, Robert Owen, to establish government schools in America. So he set these government schools up in Massachusetts based on the Prussian model of education. He was a socialist. He wanted the government schools to equalize all men. He wanted the Bible out. And he also introduced this quackery known as the whole word method, or the look-say method of teaching reading. Basically, instead of teaching the kids what the letters sound like and then how to decode a word based on what the letters sound like, they started teaching the kids an entire word as if it were a Chinese character, right? So you can see this picture here. They show them a picture of a fish, and then they show them some squiggly lines, and they say those squiggly lines mean fish. Or they show them a picture of a fork, some squiggly lines, those squiggly lines mean fork, right? They don't tell them that the F makes a f sound, and the O makes a sound, and the R makes a sound, right? They just say that means fork. And within a few years, it was a total disaster. The kids developed what we would today call dyslexia. And so all the schoolmasters in Boston got together. They said, we're not doing that anymore. This idea proposed by Mr. Mann is not called for or sustained by sound reasoning. Around the time that Horace Mann was doing this in Massachusetts, Karl Marx was spreading these ideas in Europe. And he found most success in what would eventually become Germany. And, we all saw how well that worked out, right? Within a few generations, they were goose-stepping around and chanting Heil Hitler and putting people in camps and invading their neighbors and all the rest of it. Didn't work out well for them. It's not going to work out well for us either. This whole word quackery was put to rest after Horace Mann, but then this guy came along, John Dewey, who is universally acknowledged as the founding father of America's educational system, and he resurrected it. Rather than going to Prussia for his inspiration, he went to the Soviet Union. He loved what Lenin was doing. In fact, he wrote articles in the New Republic talking about how wonderful it was. They were instilling this collectivistic mentality in the children. He wanted to use the schools to create a new social order. And I mentioned the book Crimes of the Educators that we wrote. One of the essays that John Dewey wrote was so revealing that we republished the whole thing in this book, word for word. And in this essay, he basically said, we don't got to teach the little kids how to read, write, and do math. What they really need is to be properly socialized so they can be good little collectivists. But then he said, and this is a direct quote, change must come gradually. To force it unduly would compromise its final success by favoring a violent reaction. So he knew parents and teachers would not go for this. Instead, he went to the Rockefellers, said, hey guys, can we have some money? They gave him millions of dollars. He set up an experimental school, cranked out a bunch of illiterates who couldn't tell right from wrong. And they said, that will be perfect. Let's do that all over America. So they took over the Teachers College at Columbia University, the most prestigious educational institution in the United States. And they developed these whole word readers to resurrect the quackery that had failed so miserably under Horace Mann. Some of you watching this presentation now may have been handicapped by Dick and Jane. right? See, spot, run, right? If you were lucky, you had a teacher who taught you phonics first. If not, you may still struggle with reading to this day. Fortunately, in 1955, this quackery was exposed once again in the book Why Johnny Can't Read, caused a national scandal. He said the teaching of reading all over the United States, in all the schools, in all the textbooks, is totally wrong and flies in the face of all logic and common sense. Now we have brain scans that prove that this actually does physical damage to the brains of the children, right? This doctor in France has been studying this for some time, and you're probably not surprised to know that under Common Core, it is mandatory that kindergartners memorize sight words, right? My friend and late colleague, Dr. Sam Blumenfeld, used to call that the thalidomide of the brain, right? That drug that made the babies be born with no arms or short arms and short legs, right? It is a completely deforming the minds, the brains of these children. So this is what it looks like in a classroom, right? The list of words they have to memorize. And now the UN Educational Agency, basically the Global Education Ministry, thinks that children all over the world should learn a sight vocabulary. Now I want to talk about John Dewey's religion for a moment, because he was a very religious man. This is his religion. In fact, he said so. He was one of the authors and the signers of the first Humanist Manifesto. He said, religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. Right? If you've read the first page of your Bible, you know that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So John Dewey was coming out just boldly declaring, we reject the Bible, we reject the existence of God, and by extension, they reject the self-evident truths that our republic was founded on. Right? The Founding Fathers didn't say you had to be a Bible scholar to recognize that God created us and that God endowed us with inalienable rights. They said it was a self-evident truth. This was not even a religious statement. It's just obvious. It's plain to see. You are without excuse if you can't observe something so obvious. And yet, John Dewey rejected that. And what happens if you reject the Creator? Well, there, by extension, you reject God-given rights. Now, this religion of John Dewey's, in fact, was not new. He didn't invent it, the idea that man and women could be their own little gods, and they could decide for themselves what's right and wrong without God and 10 Commandments and all that kind of stuff. Where have we heard that before? Oh, yeah, Genesis 3:5, right? God knows that when you eat that fruit, you will be as gods. Then you'll know good and evil. So just disobey God, why don't you, right? This, unfortunately, became the official religion of the United States. In 1962, the Supreme Court banned prayer. The state of New York had a prayer developed by Protestants, Catholics, and Jews, totally non-sectarian. God, we acknowledge our dependence on you. We beg your blessings on our parents, teachers, and country. Amen. The Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. First Amendment. 1963, they said no more Bibles at school. And they said the First Amendment required this. Anybody read the First Amendment? Congress shall make no law. Is the state of New York Congress? Obviously not. Is the school district Congress? Obviously not. But to his credit, at least one Supreme Court justice realized what was happening. He said these rulings led not to a state of neutrality with respect to religion, but rather the establishment of a religion of secularism, or humanism, as John Dewey would have called it. Now we have a global abomination of an education system. And they've been working on it for a long time, right? In the 40s, they got the Declaration of Human Rights. They said education must be compulsory. They said it must further the activities of the UN. They set up the UNESCO, where the first Secretary General, Julian Huxley, said the goal was world government. They put out a pamphlet in 1949 saying schools should combat family attitudes. Fast forward to 1990, they brought all the governments of the world together, and they said that the basic learning content required by all human beings is no longer the responsibility of the family or the church or the school district or even your state legislature or your Supreme Court. Now it's a common and universal responsibility. So Castro and Mugabe and Rocket Man and the Saudi regime and the Iranians, they all get to help decide what our children should be learning. Article 5 of this agreement that they came up with, the first ever global agreement on education, said all children need to learn from the same standards of learning. In 2000, they got even bolder. They met in Africa. They said education must recognize the need for changes in the attitudes, values, and practices of children. Here's the Secretary General of the UN in 2015 explaining what he thinks is the purpose of education.
Education must do more than produce individuals who can read, write, and count. It must nurture global citizens who can rise to the challenges of the 21st century.
So education should nurture global citizens, right? And I've asked literally many thousands of people on my speaking tour, did anyone send their kid to school so they become good global citizens? Not a single person has ever raised their hand in response to that question. So in 2016, they got even bolder. They said education has to shape the spirituality of your children. This is Irina Bokova. She was actually running the UNESCO until last year. actual member of the Bulgarian Communist Party. She served as a high-ranking official in the mass-murdering dictatorship that had enslaved Bulgaria. They massacred an estimated 222,000 people in a very small country with a population of about 7 million, to give you some perspective of the scale of this slaughter. And she put out she hates me with a passion, by the way, which makes me happy. But she put out this press release before she left office, and she said the UNESCO has the collective duty to empower every child with the right values to be global citizens. Also on UNESCO's webpage, you'll find this, an Education for Sustainable Development Toolkit. They tell you that more highly educated people with higher incomes consume more resources than poorly educated people. In this case, more education increases the threat to sustainability, right? So educating your kids makes them unsustainable adults. They have this board game now for government school children in schools all over the world. They make them answer questions so that they can move on. It's part of Agenda 2030. And one of the questions, and you should read the questions, it will blow your mind. One of the questions was, what is the best way to fight poverty? Now, if you had two brain cells to rub together, you'd say, well, where do we have the least amount of poverty? Oh, yeah, America, where poor people have color TVs and air conditioners and SUVs and more food than they could possibly do anything with. They'd turn it into obese, right? But no, right? Instead, they say the answer is to share the wealth produced in the world. And if you want to know how well that works, I hear Venezuela is really nice this time of year. Now, here is UNESCO talking about what they are doing. Check this out.
The Education 2030 Agenda is our roadmap to inclusive and quality education for all. UNESCO, the UN's specialized agency for education, is leading the global and regional coordination of this ambitious goal, responding to cutting-edge global challenges, supporting countries to build better education systems, and monitoring progress to make sure the world stays on course.
So the global education system, we've got to monitor countries to make sure the world stays on course, right? Except they're not talking about America, right? They're just talking about third world countries that don't know anything about education. Wrong, right? Here's Arnie Duncan. He spent 7 years as Obama's education secretary. He gave a speech to UNESCO. He said, UNESCO is our global partner in creating green global citizens. He quoted a communist terrorist. I won't tell you which one because we need another presentation. But he said, education is the most powerful weapon that you can use to change the world. He said, education is a global public good, unconstrained by national boundaries. He said, we're infusing sustainability into the curriculum from kindergarten through 12th grade. And of course, now we really do truly have a global education system, just as Arnie Duncan promised. Very few people realize this, even though you can read the World Core Curriculum on UNESCO's website, that we have global standards. It's called the World Core Curriculum. It was developed by this guy here, Robert Mueller, and he was a weirdo, to put it mildly. He thought the United Nations was the body of Christ, to quote him exactly. And so he developed this World Core Curriculum, and in the teacher's manual for this, there was a bombshell. He said the underlying philosophy that his standards are based on will be found in the teachings set forth in the books of Alice Bailey by the Tibetan teacher Javal Kul. And to almost everybody in America, that means nothing. To everybody in UN leadership, that means everything, right? So let me tell you a little bit about Alice Bailey. We'll start with her. She was the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company. Nice person to base your global World Core Curriculum on, right? Lucifer Publishing Company. The name was a little controversial, so they changed it to Lucius Trust after some years. This Tibetan teacher, Javal Kul, turns out he's not Tibetan, he's not a teacher, he's not even a human being. Alice Bailey claimed to be in communication with these spiritual entities that she described as ascended masters. Javal Kul was the lead one of these. Christians know these better as demons. And they would write these books for her, she said. They would take over her body and write these books. And again, this is not me saying this, right? This is the guy who wrote the World Core Curriculum saying his World Core Curriculum is based on the books of this lunatic. And this is one of the books. It's called Education in the New Age. And if you read it, and you should, it says, world citizenship should be the goal of the enlightened with a world federation and a world brain. Our problem is to attain the kind of overall synthesis that Marxism and neo-scholasticism provide for their followers, but to get this by the freely chosen cooperative methods that John Dewey advocated. Enter Bill Gates, right? Everybody knows Bill Gates put $2.3 billion of his own money into Common Core. What far fewer people know is that in 2004, he went over to meet the head of UNESCO, this guy right here, and they signed an agreement. He signed on behalf of Microsoft to create a master curriculum for the world, global standards. They wrote in the agreement that Microsoft supports the objectives of UNESCO. And I want to show you real quick a video produced by the Common Core people. This is a commercial explaining to us why we should like Common Core. And again, it's them telling you this, not me, right? That's what I show you.
Up until now,
so check this out.
It's been pretty hard to tell how well kids are competing in school and how well they're going to do when they get out of school. Is a girl in your neighborhood being taught as much as her friend over in the next one? Is a graduating senior in, say, St. Louis as prepared to get a job as the graduate in Shanghai? Well, it turns out the answer to both of these questions is no. Because for years, states have been setting different standards for what students should know and be able to do at each grade level. What we really need are clear goals. That's where the Common Core state standards come in. The standards are consistent from school to school, and they match up against international standards too. Now we know how we're doing compared to just about everyone. So even though local communities will still design their own curriculum, with the same rules, everybody can compete on the same kind of staircase.
Isn't that cute? And that's them telling you, right? That's them telling you. Kids, your kids in whatever American city you're in will learn the same garbage as communist Chinese kids in Shanghai, as socialists in Paris, and on, right? Unfortunately, this has not stopped under the current administration. This is Betsy DeVos down in Argentina for the G20 meeting, signed a deal where they said we're going to keep infusing the curriculum with sustainable development. Mind you, this is an agreement with the Saudi Arabian dictatorship that'll chop your head off for becoming a Christian. This is an agreement with the communist Chinese government that has murdered more individuals than any government in human history. And they're signing this international agreement to work on their shared values and continue internationalizing education. So back to the polling data, most young Americans on any poll you look at are now officially socialist. They're leaving the churches in droves. Protestant Christianity is in catastrophic decline. None, atheists, secularists, humanists, Satanists, etc., rising like a rocket ship, right? So now, all of that is documented fact. We're going to run just a few minutes over, guys, so bear with me. But everything I just showed you now is a documented fact. You can find it from first-hand documents. You can find it from them. That's why I show you the videos, right? So you don't have to believe me. Now I'm just going to spend a few minutes giving you my opinion and, more importantly, what the Bible has to say about these things. So the first question we need to ask is, can we reform this system? Well, we've been trying to do it for 60 years. And have we made a lot of progress? No, right? Quite the opposite. In fact, it's like banging your head against a brick wall. You'd get better results. We have made absolutely no progress. The public schools get worse every single day that passes. I mean, you know, we're almost not surprised anymore that they're teaching pedophilia in the classroom, that they're showing hardcore pornography to children, that they're forcing kids to recite the Islamic Shahada, that half of our kids are illiterate, right? It doesn't even surprise us anymore. We're just used to it. It's just so incredibly bad. You cannot reform this. Why can you not reform it? Because it's doing exactly what the people who created it wanted it to do, right? Exactly. It'd be like taking your perfectly working brand new car to the mechanic and say, hey, can you fix this for me? He'd be like, what do you mean? It's running perfectly. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Cranking out little socialists and humanists by the millions, right? This guy here was actually involved in the effort to create government schools back when that was a crazy idea. And he repented, he came to Christ, and he tried to blow the whistle on his co-conspirators. He said the great object was to get rid of Christianity. We're going to get rid of all religion in school, and we're going to force parents to send their kids there by law. This is Congressman Thomas Massey, one of my favorite congressmen. I interviewed him. He's got a great bill right now, H.R. 899, to shut down the Department of Education. I love the idea. It's great. I highly encourage people to support the bill. Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to solve the problem, certainly not anytime soon. So anybody thinking that, hey, I'm going to keep sending my kids to government school and hope this bill passes, you got to reconsider, right? So in the interest of time, we'll skip through that. As I see it today, we're down to two options. Option one, got to get the children out as quickly as we can in as large a numbers as we can, or face imminent destruction. Option two, just prepare to lose all your freedoms and to lose your country. So I don't think I need to say this explicitly, but I will. Parents, get your children out of the school system. I compare it to a burning building. If the building was burning, you would not say, well, you know what? I think I'm going to go to the school meeting, the school board meeting, and I'm going to recommend that we form a committee so that we can see about possibly hiring some firefighters and see if they can maybe go put that fire out before it burns my child to a crisp, right? You would be nuts to do something like that. And yet the schools today are a danger to the physical well-being of your children, to the academic well-being, the moral well-being, the spiritual well-being. They are dangerous to your children in every possible way. Right? Act like that building's on fire, grab those kids and run as fast as you can in the other direction. If you're a grandparent, you can help your kids to understand this. Maybe you can volunteer to watch the kids 1 or 2 days a week. Maybe you can help the homeschooling. Maybe if your kids need a little bit of financial help while they sort it out, maybe you can help fund a little bit of a scholarship to a good private school. You know, everybody has a role to play here. I compare it to kind of a Dunkirk operation, right? When the British people put every resource in their society at the disposal of this rescue operation to rescue those boys from being annihilated by Hitler's National Socialists, right? They put every boat that could float on the water. They picked up as many troops as they could, and they brought them back before Hitler destroyed them all. And it worked, right? So we need to be thinking in those terms. Pastors, priests, rabbis, There's a very important job for you here too, right? God placed you at the head of your congregation to serve as a shepherd. You are supposed to be warning your congregation of exactly the type of stuff that I just proved to you is now happening, right? There's a study by the Nehemiah Institute that shows 80% of Christian children who go through a government indoctrination program for 12 years will leave their churches. Your church is not going to survive another generation or two of this. Our country is not going to survive another generation or two of this. Get serious. Warn your congregation and help provide alternatives. Maybe that means setting up a Christian school. Maybe that means getting together with 10 other pastors and setting up a Christian school. Maybe that means setting up a scholarship fund so that low-income people in your congregation can get their kids out. Do something. We also need to understand, why do we have education, right? America is and always has been a Christian nation. It was founded on Christianity. And so it's important for us to see, what did our founders, what did the people who created this country believe about education? And what does the Bible have to say about education, right? The Bible was the rock upon which America was founded on, right? So what did the founders believe about education? What did the Bible say about education? Well, and who should be in charge of it, right? Well, the Bible says that Caesar ought to train up, oh, no, wait, it doesn't say that at all, does it? It says parents should train up a child in the way that he should go, and even when he's old, he will not depart from it, right? Caesar never should have been put in charge of education. That is not Caesar's job. Proverbs 9:10 tells us that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, right? You're not even allowed to mention the Lord in a public school today, except if it's Allah, right? Or Buddha, or one of those things. You can meditate, you can do your Hindu stuff, but you can never mention the God of the Bible, right? And so do you think there's going to be any wisdom there? Proverbs 1:7 says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Think there's going to be any knowledge there? Martin Luther said if the schools didn't teach the scriptures, then the schools would become the great gates of hell. For Catholics, the Pope said that any education that doesn't have God at the center of it is false and full of error. Harvard used to be a really great school, believe it or not, and they said the main purpose of a person's life and studies is to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life. Fancy that, they are no longer Christian anymore, but they were. Right? So I think homeschooling is amazing. That's a picture of my family doing homeschooling, right? Because we're always doing homeschooling no matter what we're doing. There we are on a trip, but we're doing homeschooling. And these men here were all primarily homeschooled. Not one of them ever stepped foot in a government school, believe it or not. And they went on to create the greatest, freest, most amazing, prosperous nation in the history of humanity. And they did it all without 1 second of government education. So there's good news on the homeschool front. We have more than 2.5 million homeschoolers in America. Homeschoolers are running circles around the victims of the government schools. They're ending up in the 80th to 90th percentile on the government's own standardized tests, even when the mother doesn't have a high school diploma, and they do it all for a fraction of the cost, right? Homeschoolers spend about $500 a year on education. Government schools spend between $10,000 and $18,000 or even $20,000 a year, and then they can't even graduate kids who can read their high school diploma. Something is very wrong here. Again, the data is amazing. The homeschoolers are now winning all the spelling bees, science fairs, etc. Universities are out there actively recruiting them. Homeschoolers are better socialized on every possible metric. They have better self-image. They have less problem behaviors. They do better as adults. There are a lot of really great private schools, many, many great private schools, but buyer beware, right? There's a lot of very bad private schools also. About half of the Catholic dioceses in America are today using Common Core in their school systems. Do not put your kids in a Common Core school, even if it purports to be Catholic. Protestant schools, a lot of them are phenomenal. A lot of them are doing great things. A lot of them, unfortunately, are just carbon copies of the government schools, and they just charge you $5,000 for the privilege. So be careful, right? If they're using government school textbooks, don't put your kids there, right? Simple enough. I teach at the Freedom Project Academy. It's an online K-12 classical education. We teach real phonics, we teach real history, we teach real science. Our kids are doing amazing. We do need to recognize that the UN and governments around the world are not happy with parents opting out of this system, right? I was living in Sweden when the government there banned homeschooling and forced all private schools, all of which were already taking tax money, to start teaching the government curriculum. And then they started kidnapping homeschool children from parents, right? The UN passed a resolution, their Human Rights Council, dominated by dictators, that all schools in the world, including all private schools, must submit to the monitoring and regulation of the UN and governments. They said they all have to teach the same global standards that everyone else gets. And we need to be aware that right now, even though we have incredible educational freedom in America, you can opt your children out of this madness in every single state in the union without any legal problems whatsoever. We need to recognize that this fight is coming. probably sooner than any of us would like to admit. So first step, protect your children. Second step, make sure we preserve our educational liberties. And, you know, I know there's a lot of people who have a lot of different ideas on what we need to do. And I know there's a lot of Americans out there who think, well, you know what? I've got my gun and they're never going to take my gun and I'm going to protect my freedom and all the rest of it. You know, I'm a Second Amendment guy too. I won't lie. You know, they'll take my gun from my cold dead hands. It's true. But we need to recognize that this is not a viable strategy for preserving our republic, for preserving our freedom. It's not going to work, folks. They don't need the guns. They've got the kids, right? What are you going to do with your guns when it's your kids coming to take them? Absolutely nothing, and I can guarantee it. So Hitler put it this way. He said, when an opponent declares, I will not come to your side, I calmly say, your child belongs to us already. You will pass on, but your descendants now stand in the new camp. In a short time, they will know nothing else but this new community. And folks, that's where we are today, right? Go talk to a high school kid in a government school today. Ask them about the founding fathers. Oh, those dead white guys had slaves and they're genocidal, right? Ask them about the Declaration of Independence. Ask them about God-given rights. Ask them about the Bible. Ask them about anything that matters, right? Nothing. They know all about gender theory. They know all about how the CO2 that they exhale is going to kill us all if we don't give the UN all power and authority, but they don't know anything about anything that matters. Ask them about the history of socialism. Ask them how many people were murdered by their own socialist and communist government in the last 100 years. Ask them about the history of Islam and the conquests of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula and the genocide. Ask them anything about that. Blank, right? Absolutely nothing. So what we need now is an exodus from government schools of massive proportions. We can look to our founding fathers. They put their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on the line for God and for freedom. The odds were actually terrible, right? They were going up against the most powerful empire that had ever existed in human history, and the odds did not look good, right? The most powerful military, and they did it anyway. And they won. Right? And fortunately today, we don't have to put our lives on the line. That's nice. We don't even have to put our fortunes or our sacred honor on the line. In fact, there's also a lot of added benefits, right? You'll have happier and better educated children. You'll have a stronger marriage. You'll have a stronger family. You'll have stronger churches, stronger communities, stronger morals, and another ally in the fight for freedom. I'm going to ask you guys to do just one thing before we close here. If you agree with me that this information is important, in fact, if you agree that this is now an existential threat to our freedom, if we don't deal with this educational system, we're going to lose our country, we're going to lose our freedom, we're going to lose our Constitution, we're going to lose our kids, we're going to lose everything, folks. If you agree with me that this is that important, go ahead and get some copies of this, right? Maybe start with one if you want, just to make sure you think this is good and interesting. Basically, you'll get an extended version of everything I just gave you here, right? You'll learn all about what's happening in the government schools, the history, how we got here. Very, very cheap and simple tool. You can get them in bulk for $1. Give one to everybody you know in a position of influence. Give one to your pastor. Give one to the elders at your church. Give one to that school teacher in your life. Give one to your neighbor that's got the kids who go to public school every day. Give one to the radio host in your community. Give one to people of influence in your community. For our illiterate friends, and we know there are lots of them, you can use this DVD here. It's only $1 if you order them in bulk. You can get them at thenewamerican.com/rescuingourchildren, or you can call Monday through Friday, call 1-800-342-6491, and you can get all of this and much more. And what we're trying to do here, folks, we're trying to get 1 million copies of this out. We did get 1 million copies of a special report we did out in 2007 in the New American Magazine exposing the effort to integrate the United States, Mexico, and Canada under a EU-style government. And guess what? The guy who was leading that effort, a globalist at the Council on Foreign Relations, said it was that effort that stopped this plan under the Bush and Obama administration. So, folks, this works. You can bypass the media, but you have to get active. So, step one, protect your kids at all costs. Step two, get the word out so that other people can take action and protect their own kids. Most people don't know this stuff, folks. I guarantee you, if you're sitting here listening to this, you did not know much of what we went over. I mean, everybody knows it's bad, right? 7 out of 10 Americans already say they want to pull their kids out of government schools. That's a good start. You got to wonder what's wrong with the other 3 out of 10. But they don't know how bad it is, folks. Very, very few people know how bad it is. Teachers know how bad it is. That's why they homeschool and send their kids to private school in massively, massively higher numbers than regular members of the public, because they know, right? So, folks, get involved, take action. Now, if you're a Christian, I want you to understand, too, that we're not just dealing with bad ideas. We are not just dealing with people who disagree with us politically. even though, that's very much a problem, but it only scratches the surface of what we're dealing with here. The Bible has a lot to say on what we're facing. It says in Ephesians 6:12, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, and against spiritual wickedness in high places. Folks, that's what we're dealing with. So if you're a praying person, get on your knees and pray for this country, pray for our president, pray for our children, pray for our schools and for our school teachers, because, folks, we are this close to losing it all. God help us. God bless you all. And thank you very much for listening. Dick and Mary, thank you again for having me. I really, really appreciate it. And I will stop sharing my screen now and let you guys take over.
Wow. Well, on behalf of the large number of people who joined us tonight, I will give you a virtual standing ovation. I mean, this was a symphony, very, very well presented, very, very well researched, and just tremendous content that is irrefutable. So I'll just say thank you. I know we have a lot of people, Mary, that are wanting to get their questions answered. So why don't we move right to the questions?
Okay. We can do that, and from me as well. Thank you. This the detail of what you presented was just amazing, and again, it was, it's a threat to the American society, and if we don't get it fixed in terms of our education, in terms of our children, we've got a major mess we're going to have to be dealing with. So we've got quite a few questions. Let's see if we can go through them. John is asking, how does one go about contacting your local school board and requesting the tenets of their curriculum? And I will add to that myself. Is that something that people can do, should do, or is that going to be a waste of time and just get them out of schools is where you think they need to go?
Well, I think getting out of the schools is the first and most important thing. After that, I compare it to the burning building. After you get your kids out of the burning building, then we can stop and think, all right, well, there's a burning building there. What do we do? Right? And so as part of that, I do think it's a good idea to try to get these materials, if only because, there's this tendency among a lot of people who are just addicted to the free daycare that the government schools provide to try to come up with any rationalization. And one of the things that I heard over and over again as I was traveling through conservative states is, well, yeah, that happens in New York and Illinois and California, but, they're weird. We don't do that in Oklahoma. We don't do that in Montana. Yes, they absolutely do. It is everywhere, folks. It is in the most conservative rural district of Oklahoma or Nebraska. It is everywhere, folks. So go to your local school board. It's going to be different in every state, right? In Florida, we have tremendous sunshine state laws. They call them sunshine laws, where you can get access to basically any government document. In some cases, they'll try to fight you because they're embarrassed. They know parents would freak out if they saw some of the stuff that's being taught to the kids. But if you need to, team up with a lawyer, sue them, get this stuff, and then spread that information in your community. Go to your local newspaper. If your local newspaper won't help you get the story out, go print up flyers and go drop them off in people's mailboxes. Say, this is what they're teaching in our district. I guarantee if you get the data, if you get the facts, it's going to be atrocious. And even progressives, even liberal, Obama-loving progressives don't want their kids exposed to this stuff. They do want their kids to learn how to read. So I think it's a good idea. And I encourage people to run for school board. They'll do their best to try to dissuade you and tell you can't do anything from there. After you've protected their kids, get involved with the school board.
Okay, we've got Karen that is talking about the elections and how important it is to understand where we're going with this and the new voters that are coming out. So she's got some concerns where we're going to end up in this next election. And she's also talking about the Department of Education. We should focus on getting the UN off U.S. soil. Can you talk to both of those?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The UN has no business being on our soil. I mean, this is an abomination. They're bringing in spies and terrorists and mass murderers and dictators. And, of course, the UN is now playing a major role in our education system, as I just showed you. In every school district in this country, you will have UN-backed, UN-inspired, UN-provided tools, resources, propaganda without exception, literally without exception. So, big problem. The election, I'm glad someone asked about the political implications of this. Folks, if you project the lines, and the other side knows this already, right? That's why the Democrats are becoming so openly radical. A few years ago, they knew they couldn't quite come out of the closet yet. They couldn't say, we're going to come and confiscate your guns. They couldn't say, we're going to dismantle the border agency. They couldn't say, we're going to redistribute all your wealth. Now they know. They've looked at the numbers. Give it another few years. Conservatives are going to start losing every major national election. The numbers do not look good, folks. Every year that passes, older, more conservative Americans who have an understanding of our history pass on to, you know, go home to their eternal reward, and more young people come out of the high schools, out of the government indoctrination centers, radicalized and ready to tear down this country. Give it a few more years, and we need to be thinking long term. The 2020 election is incredibly important as a means of just allowing Donald Trump to continue holding these people back for another 4 years. Make sure you're involved in the election, but we need to be thinking beyond that too. What happens in 2022? What happens in 2024? What happens in 2030 and 2040 when our kids and our grandkids are growing up? Guys, we need to think long term here. They are thinking long term. They've been thinking long term for a very long time. And so we need to address this. The reality is, if we continue on the path we're on, the overwhelming majority of the American voting electorate is going to be socialist within a generation. And at that point, you know, there's no going back. With absent a miracle, absent some sort of divine intervention, America will become a socialist country, and we will be one of the first nations in history to actually vote ourselves into that predicament. So again, it happened all through the government schools, and that is their strategy. That's where we need to focus.
We've got one question, or one personal account, that's basically saying, I have children that went to the Catholic school and I saw their faith started to crumble in high school and more during university. It's so bad. How do we start homeschooling? What is the requirement?
Yeah, very, very good question. And, you know, that's why I always tell people, be very careful about what school you're putting your children in. You know, Trevor Loudon, who I know has worked with you guys, he's done The Enemies Within. His current project is Enemies Within the Church, and God bless him for that, because what he's showing is that huge numbers of Marxists and subversives infiltrated the Catholic seminaries, the Protestant seminaries. So even a lot of parents, they say, oh, I'm safe. I'm sending my kids to an $8,000 a year Catholic school. Think again, right? A lot of these are teaching the social justice nonsense. A lot of them are teaching the Common Core nonsense. So you got to be, and you know, that's not to criticize all private schools. There's a lot of Catholic schools out there providing a phenomenal education, a lot of Jewish schools providing a great education, and a lot of Protestant providing excellent educations. But there are many that are absolutely terrible. So I think homeschooling is really the gold standard for the people who can do it. The laws vary very widely by state. Some states, there's literally no requirements at all. And even some of the liberal states, believe it or not, Connecticut, Illinois, you don't even have to tell anybody. You just homeschool your kids, and that's the end of the story. Other states are much, much more invasive. They want to test your kids. They want to talk to your kids. They want to subject them to psychological assessments. So I have some reservations about the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, even though I am a member, but I will recommend them very highly for finding out about the legal requirements in your state. Go to hslda.org, and you will be able to look up your state there. They'll tell you everything you need to do in a simple format. And if you do want to homeschool, I do recommend that you join as a member, either that or one of the other comparable organizations. There's a few out there that do similar things. It's kind of like an insurance policy. If the government ever comes after you over your homeschooling, you know, for something having to do with the law, they will do whatever it takes to protect you. If necessary, they'll send down an army of attorneys to stand up for you in court. So you don't want to face the government on your own on these things. Make sure you've got backup. But you can find out all the requirements at hslda.org. So.
We've got Brenda asking about the UN again, and is there anything that they can do, individuals can do, to break the link between the United Nations and the education system?
Phenomenal question, and thank you for asking it. Our dear president has done some very important things. You know, I sounded a little bit down on Betsy DeVos, and I think my criticism is justified. But the president has done some very, very good things. Thing number one that he did that I think is just incredible, he withdrew us from UNESCO. That is huge. Now, that doesn't mean that UNESCO's influence is out of our schools. In fact, far from it. UNESCO is still all over our schools, but the U.S. government is no longer a member of UNESCO. That's huge. So if you think about it, send the White House a message, tell them, thank you for getting us out of UNESCO. Please make sure that we never get back in. But you know what? Ronald Reagan got us out of UNESCO, and then George Bush got us right back in at the earliest possible opportunity. So we need to realize that once Donald Trump is no longer president, hopefully that won't be until 2024, 2025, then we need to realize that we will almost certainly be right back in, depending on the outcome of that election. Unfortunately, at the local level now, it's becoming very, very difficult to make change. And even at the state legislature level, parents have been trying, organizations have been trying. I think the bigger picture on this, you know, to go outside a little bit of the education field, there's a phenomenal bill in Congress right now, H.R. 204. It's called the American Sovereignty Restoration Act. It was introduced by Congressman Thomas Massey. It's got, I think, 9 to 10 co-sponsors right now. In previous Congresses, it's had dozens of co-sponsors. It's in the House Foreign Affairs Committee right now. I think Donald Trump probably would very seriously consider signing it if it ever came to his desk. And it would remove the United States from the United Nations completely. It would evict their terrorist headquarters from our soil. It would prohibit U.S. troops from ever serving under UN command again. And it would end our involvement in all of these different UN agencies like UNESCO and UNICEF and all these that are involved in education. So unfortunately, you know, at the local level, it's very difficult to get the UNESCO influence out. It's in the textbooks, it's in the teacher training, you know, the teacher's college that your teacher went to get a teacher certification with the state has already brainwashed them with UNESCO propaganda. You know, it's like trying to put the toothpaste back into the tube. It's very, very difficult.
We've got a question that's asking, would it be productive would it be productive to get our state senators and legislators to create state laws to protect the educational freedom for homeschooling and private Christian schools?
Absolutely. Absolutely. State legislators can be your best allies in this fight. You know, the other side is on them too, but by and large, you know, state legislators are more often than not just normal people. You know, some of them get their egos all puffed up because the lobbyists come and shower them with praise and tell them how important they are. But really, they're just normal people, right? They're your neighbors and stuff. Make sure you have a relationship with your state legislator. Make sure you have a relationship with your state senator, because when bad bills come, you need to know so that you can marshal forces to come against it. When good bills are there, you need to know so that you can marshal your forces to come out and support that. There's a lot that state legislators can do. We've now been working with state legislators all across the country trying to get some bills filed to completely sever the relationship between the federal government and the schools. Would be very easy to do. And, you know, what they always fall back on is, well, you know, the federal government gives us federal education funding, and if we don't obey all their demands, then we're not going to have federal funding anymore. You know what? The federal funding makes up about 10%, depending on what state you're in, of the funding. By the time you look at all the money that's spent on complying with all the crazy mandates and dictates coming out of Washington, D.C., you've already spent well over 10% of your education budget on doing that. So states would probably save money. They absolutely should be doing that. But another caveat, this is not a substitute for taking the children out. Again, you know, I think it's first you get your kids out of the burning building, then we start working on these types of initiatives. So I love those ideas. I encourage them. I'm working on some of them myself. But, you know, I don't think that anybody should see working on those initiatives as an excuse to continue allowing their children to go to a public school.
Well, for our last question, and I think this may be a question that I think a lot of parents are concerned. They don't have the time, they don't have the skills, they don't have the wherewithal to put together a homeschooling program. They don't know where to get started. If they are both parents are working to pay off bills for their economic status, what would you say to them in terms of trying to homeschool? Is there a program where there's homeschooling in a neighborhood? Do you know of homeschooling that is one of the churches that provides anything like that? What would you recommend?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. And, you know, this is one of those that I could spend a week talking about. I'll limit myself to just a few minutes. But, you know, first of all, to the parents who say, I don't think I can afford homeschooling, I'll just be very blunt. I don't think you can afford not to homeschool. You know, when your kid comes home addicted to drugs, when your kid comes home wanting hormone treatment so they can mutilate their genitals to become a different gender, when your kid comes home with a secret abortion, when your kid comes home illiterate, when your kid comes home cutting himself or wanting to commit suicide because of the crazy stuff that was put into his or her head, you'll realize, wow, you know, it wasn't that I couldn't afford to get them out, it's that I couldn't afford to leave them in. So make sure you get them out before you come to that tragic realization. Yeah, I tell people all the time, I would sooner live in a cardboard box than send my children to a government school. And I'm dead serious. There's nothing anyone could do to get me to surrender my children to a government school. Nothing. No amount of money on this planet would convince me to do that. And we live in the richest society that has ever been produced in all of human history. And yet people thousands of years ago who were living in mud huts, barely eking by a living, you know, scratching some grain out of the soil, somehow they found the time to educate and raise their children. We don't need the government to raise our children for us. There are lots and lots of options out there. There are even scholarships for people who are low income. I mentioned HSLDA. They actually have a foundation that helps low income homeschool parents. So if that's you, you may consider something like that. Talk to your church. Maybe they can help set up a scholarship fund. I mentioned that I teach at the Freedom Project Academy. We charge about $2,500 for a full year. Most of our students are actually, you know, homeschool students who just, their parents wanted a little bit more structure. Once you get into the older grades, you can take classes a la carte. So, you know, maybe you'll do some subjects at home, but hey, I don't know how to teach chemistry. I don't know how to teach, you know, advanced economics. That's where I come in. That's what I teach. Then, hey, you know, we can put them in Freedom Project for that. And there's a lot of online schools out there like this now. Liberty University has an online school like that. Bob Jones University. There's a lot of options. There's going to be a lot more options going forward. There are options for parents who have no time, right? There was a father whose wife died, and he actually came up with a program and a methodology where the kids basically homeschool themselves with just minor oversight from the dad. It works fantastically from what I understand. We're involved in a homeschool co-op here in my community. I teach American history there. My wife teaches reading to the little ones, and different parents who have different expertise just volunteer their time. So many options. I mean, there has never been a better time in human history to be a homeschooler. There are endless resources, a lot of free resources, right? Spend 5 minutes on the internet. You'll see there are endless free resources. And finally, within the next couple of months, I'm working on a project right now with some phenomenal people. It's called Leaving Public Schools. We are going to have a website up online. We have it designed. We just haven't posted it online yet because we're putting the final touches on it. But it's leavingpublicschools.org. We're going to have all kinds of information dealing with exactly these questions. How can I do it? Right? Maybe you need to downsize your home. Maybe you need to get rid of your fancy car. Maybe you need to cross off one of those vacations that you take, or have a less fancy watch. You know, somewhere you can find funds. But we're going to have strategies, you know, recommendations for curricula in different schools. So we're going to put all those types of resources in one place so that all the millions of parents across America who are asking themselves those very questions right now will have a one-stop shop for all the resources they need. So thank you all very much for those questions. I really, really appreciate it. And if you have more, you can always follow up with me, shoot me an email, or get to me on social media. So. And
I just wanted to let everybody know that after this, when I post it to our website, we're going to have a lot of links from all of this to be able to give you the information you need to go forward with it. And we've been very blessed with Alex here tonight, and all of the information and positive possibilities that he's been able to share with us.
Thank you guys so much. I sure appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. And, you know, thank you for your time. I recognize we went for a long time here. I even went over the time I should have. So thank you all for sticking around. I really appreciate it. God bless you. And I hope that you'll go out and do something now. So thank you.
Let's just move into the action items in the time we have remaining. I think you've given us tremendous guidance tonight, and I think our action item we'd like people to think about is, you know, this is a tough conversation. It's tough to think about economic downsizing to rescue your children. People go out and rescue dogs and cats every day. We would invite you to convince yourself that children are in jeopardy as long as you continue to deliver them to government schools. How tough is that to deal with? So the action item is commit to homeschool. If you have to downsize, consider that seriously. In the meantime, consider deprogramming your children on a regular basis until you can get to that point where you're taking them out of the school. The other concern that we would invite you to think through your action items, envision how much worse the indoctrination will be in 2021 if Donald Trump is not the president. I mean, Arnie Duncan will be back, or somebody like Arnie Duncan will have the Obama phenomena again. By the way, we are Sharia crime stoppers. Let's stop for a minute. The reason that we're concerned about this, of course, is the red-green axis. To the extent that the left has taken the ball and run with it in our education system, Sharia, Islam is much more acceptable, and people are attacked because they criticize Islam. So the connection between the red-green axis couldn't be more clear, and that's one of the reasons why we're so grateful to have Alex with us tonight. Another action item would be there somewhere. There it is. Okay, we are one team, one fight. The fight we want you to focus on is the 2020 fight. We don't even call it an election because it may or may not be. It's a fight. And Alex has made it crystal clear it's a fight for our children, for our families, for our freedom. We would invite you to get involved now. Commit yourself to do everything you can for your children and for your country, and engage and mobilize other parents. Taking this message forward with the material that Alex has talked about could be a turning point. People might finally realize how important all of this is. It's their child, it's their children, it's their family, it's their country. So again, we appreciate. Thank you so much, Alex and Mary, for dealing with the questions, and for the people that asked the questions and paid attention to that.
And
So
Alex,
yes.
real quick, I just wanted to let you know that I've gotten quite a few comments about how great this is and how important it is, the work you're doing, and what they need to focus on as far as their children. So a lot of people are saying thank you to you as well.
Thank you so much to all of you out there, and thank you, Mary. Thank you, Dick, and thank you guys for what you're doing. It's patriots like you who give me hope that this fight is not over yet. So thank you guys, and God bless you.
God bless.
Well, we are going to proceed with our Tuesday night webinars. Next Tuesday, we're going to have Elizabeth Savage-Wolf. She's going to talk about, from a European perspective, Muslim rights to not be offended or taking precedence over our own freedom of speech. This is going to be really, really interesting. We would invite you to come back. Trevor Loudon will be with us on October 8th. Again, he's going to be talking about what he knows about the Marxists and Socialists mobilizing thousands and thousands of voters. He's actually going to talk to us about the involvement of Communist China in our own elections. And then we're going to have 2 weeks back-to-back with David Boris, our retired police chief and co-founder of Sharia Crime Stoppers, talking about Sharia and our schools. And then after that, we'll have additional webinars for you. So we are Spear Point. I'm sorry, our website is, our email is spearpoint911@crimestoppers.org if you want to give us your feedback on an ongoing basis about tonight and other topics. We are part of the United West. The premise we've heard about tonight is that we really are in World War III, and I don't think we are going to pull any punches. The red-green axis is winning. Couldn't have been more dramatic than what we heard tonight. We are one team. We invite you to participate. It's one team preparing for the 2020 fight. If you think the kind of things we're talking about are of value, then please support the United West. Thank you for your attention, and God bless America. God bless our country, our children, and thank God for people like Alex Newman.
Amen.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.